On behalf of the Baha'i Chair for World Peace and the Department of Sociology's Critical Race Initiative, both housed in the College of Behavioral and Social Sciences, I offer you a very warm welcome to today's symposium, Conquering the Root Causes of Racial Prejudice. A special welcome to my colleague, Dr. Michael Penn, and his students from Franklin and Marshall College in Pennsylvania. We're very pleased that you could make it today. Dr. Bobo, Dr. Eberhardt, Dr. Hutchins, we are honored by your presence here today. We welcome you to the University of Maryland. Despite their busy schedules, our distinguished guests agreed to be with us today and to expand our knowledge about the root causes of racial prejudice and our responsibility toward its elimination. I would be remiss if I didn't thank another person, Dr. Rayshawn Ray, who is sitting at that end, from the Department of Sociology and the Critical Race Initiative, for his support and significant role in making possible the realization of today's symposium. Thank you very much, Dr. Ray. My name is Hoda Mahmoudi, and I am the holder of the Baha'i Chair for World Peace at the University of Maryland. Today's symposium is the launch of a series of programs sponsored by the Baha'i Chair for World Peace on the theme of structural racism and the root causes of prejudice. Racial prejudice continues to be a force of destruction to human life and destructive to the foundation of the social order. Advancing scientific knowledge about the root causes of racial prejudice is a central goal or objective of any institution of higher learning. Likewise, conquering the root causes of racial prejudice should be a fundamental goal toward building a just and harmonious society in which everyone's fundamental human rights and the right to human dignity is protected. Toward this end, the three presentations today by our distinguished speakers will expand and elucidate our understanding of the scourge of racism and will point us to solutions regarding the root causes of prejudice. Equally important to our search for solutions is the fact that racism is a major impediment to the possibility of a better world. It is a topic that is not only relevant, but is central to any endeavor toward peacemaking. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. stated, "True peace is not merely the absence of tension. It is the presence of justice." Racism and prejudice fundamentally undermine prospects for a more peaceful world. Racial prejudice perpetuates an offensive violation of human dignity, denies untold opportunities to its victims, impairs human progress, corrupts its perpetrators. There are absolutely no grounds upon which the blight of racial prejudice can be justified. Our intent in examining pathways to conquering the root causes of racial prejudice concerns the need for our recognition of the nobility and inherent dignity of every human being. It concerns our exploration and implementation of building community and society capable of supporting, encouraging, and safeguarding, especially the minorities, and in celebrating diversity's strength in enhancing and enriching culture. I would like to also mention before we start our symposium, and I introduce Dr. Rayshawn Ray, that at the annual 2014 fall lecture of the Baha'i Chair for World Peace, we will have another speaker, Dr. Eduardo Bonilla Silva, who will be talking about structural racism and the root causes of prejudice. We will have announcements. You have it already today in the flyer that is in front of you. And we also refer you to the other flyer regarding an upcoming lecture, which I'm sure that Dr. Ray will tell you more about. I also want to, before I sit down, thank Ms. Jody Williams in the back. She's the coordinator of the Office of the Baha'i Chair for World Peace, who really has done a lot of the work for bringing us all together today. Thank you, Jody, for your work. I would now like to ask Dr. Ray to please come up here and introduce our distinguished speakers.
Okay, these speakers that you have before you today are so distinguished that I'm going to introduce each of them as they come up here, because their accolades are so long that by the time I get through one of them, you'll be saying, wow, this is marvelous. First, I want to thank Dr. Hoda Mahmoudi for asking me to be a part of this initiative. I especially thank you for your hospitality, your generosity, as well as for opportunities like these that are so important for the University of Maryland community, Prince George's County, Washington, D.C., the broader Maryland area, as well as Virginia. You're really doing something special here. I also want to thank Jody as well. She's excellent. Now, probably what you have before you are some note cards. As we go throughout the presentation to kind of streamline the symposium, we ask that you write down questions. At the end, people will come through the aisles and gather those, and then I'll kind of read those off for the panelists so that we can more or less speed up the Q&A so that people are really getting the most out of this particular opportunity. First up, we have Dr. Lawrence Bobo, who is the W.E.B. Du Bois Professor of the Social Sciences at Harvard University. He holds appointments in sociology. He's also the chair of African American Studies, and he's the founding editor of Du Bois Review, which is easily becoming the most notable journal on race. He was awarded the Cooley Mead Lifetime Achievement Award for Distinguished Scholarship for the section of social psychology with the American Sociological Association. As a fellow social psychologist, that is a very, very big deal. Bobo is also an elected member of the National Academy of Science, as well as a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and the American Association of the Advancement of Science, as well as a Guggenheim Fellow. And I just want to say that Dr. Bobo is a guru, right? When I was a budding graduate student, he was the person who I would look to his career and say, gosh, if I could be just a small portion of that, I'm going to be very, very successful. So I've always tried to pattern myself after what he's done. And just to tell you how big of a deal it is for this community, I'm so glad so many people are here. His classes are so popular that other professors from other universities come and stand outside of the lecture hall just to listen to him speak. So that's the person that we have before you today. And what he'll be talking about, as you see in your handout, is laissez-faire racism, inequality, culture, and the failure of colorblindness. So I turn it over to Dr. Bobo.
Thank you so much, Rashan, for that exceedingly generous introduction. I also want to thank and congratulate the Baha'i Chair in World Peace Center, Professor Mahmoudi, and indeed the Sociology Department, the Critical Race Initiative here, and all those involved in organizing this event for helping to bring this symposium together and to spark me to think again about some ideas I started to articulate a short while ago. I've got a lot of information to try to rush through here, and I'm going to march right ahead and do it then and put out as many of these ideas as I can. We live in a moment of great irony regarding race in America. On the one hand, this is the age of Obama, is it not? With the election of the first African-American president of the United States, sparking intensified discussion of the arrival of the post-racial moment. It is also a moment when the continually conservative majority or controlling conservative majority on the U.S. Supreme Court moves ever more aggressively to assert, in effect, a doctrine of complete colorblindness. As Chief Justice Roberts declared in the 2007 Parents Involved cases, which eliminated voluntary school racial integration plans in Seattle, Washington, and Louisville, Kentucky, quote, the way to stop discrimination on the basis of race is to stop discrimination on the basis of race. Apparently, even if your purpose is a positive one. On the other hand, we face many signals that we have not yet transcended race as an idea or racism as a social condition. From stop-and-frisk policing tactics to mass incarceration, the murders of Trayvon Martin, Jordan Davis, and Renisha McBride, to viral videos from black college students at campuses like UCLA, Michigan, and Harvard, we know that serious problems along the color line live on. My purpose here today is to develop a sociological account of how racial prejudice and ideology operate today, and to do so in a manner that still warrants designation as a form of racism. In general, I aspire to make this argument in the context of expressly rejecting the claims that we are either a post-racial society or a colorblind society. I suggest that as we have witnessed the retreat of Jim Crow or segregationist racism, we have seen emerge in its place laissez-faire racism. This is a new racial ideology, one tailored to a putatively free marketplace, to putatively colorblind individuals, and to a putatively race-neutral legal structure. This new set of attitudes and beliefs protects, in the end, white privilege, it rationalizes enduring black disadvantage, and ends up perpetuating deep racial inequality. My agenda here today is to first briefly address the argument from post-racialism. Next, I turn to a more focused sociological theorization of the nature of change in race relations, drawing on William Julius Wilson's very important work, The Declining Significance of Race, Blacks and Changing American Institutions. Next, I trace empirically the decline in Jim Crow racism with national sample survey data. Then I try to outline the logic of laissez-faire racism and discuss its manifestations, its expression and attitudes, and why we ought to think of it as a quote-unquote form of collective racial resentment. Now, the 2008 election of Barack Obama sparked deep intensification of arguments that the U.S. was moving into a post-racial era. Certainly, popular journalists began to question all manner of things that had been once taken for granted, such as whether or not there was a distinctly black politics. In fact, whether whiteness, too, was also waning in its relevance as a source of identity, with the idea that we now all so prize being mixed, blended, or Beigeified, as the phrase has it, that it's become fashionable. Academic work certainly echoes these themes, with some, for example, claiming that we've arrived at the end, literally, of African American literature. Others, more social scientific in orientation, have pointed to statistics of falling rates of racial residential segregation, rising rates of racial intermarriage, and indeed increasing numbers of mixed and multiracial individuals, especially among younger people, as in effect profoundly and inevitably destabilizing old racial identities and barriers. Now, it's not my purpose here to engage and debunk these claims in detail. That's last year's lecture. Rather, I wish to take note of the current dominance of the post-racial, or at least increasingly colorblind narrative. That's the prevailing zeitgeist, that's what's in the air around each and every one of us. The potence of this narrative in the interpretation and logic of the Roberts Supreme Court, for example, is asserted with special force, especially regarding their claims about the highly suspect nature of racial distinctions. Roberts writes, again in the parents-involved case, government actions dividing us by race is inherently suspect because such classifications promote notions of racial inferiority and lead to the politics of racial hostility. It reinforces the belief held by too many for too much of our history that individuals should be judged by the color of their skin. Now, we can debate the ahistorical and asocial reading of history embedded in these sorts of statements from the good justice, but the reigning legal force of this line of argument cannot be ignored or minimized. As social scientists, however, we should insist on some clear and definable markers of what might constitute actual arrival of the colorblind or post-racial moment. And I just want to sketch what those should involve. First and foremost, it would mean that we really lived in a world where there was no significant connection between racial identity and background and material standard of living. We know from poverty rates, unemployment rates, and health outcomes, well, sadly, that just ain't the case yet. We got a road to travel. It would involve a world in which there was no significant connection between racial identity and political standing. That is, in terms of how you were treated by the state and in the eyes of the law. And I've already rattled off for you 3 names that deeply trouble that sort of claim. Trayvon Martin, Dunn, and McBride. I'll talk a little later about the problem of mass incarceration. Thirdly, we should observe no significant connection between racial identity and social standing, the sort of esteem and regard with which one is greeted in the eyes of one's fellow citizens. I think you feel by the end of this that I probably burdened you with the heavy weight of just how much racism, micro, macro, and mesoaggression continues to occur out there in the world. So the long and the short of it is, we're far, far from having met these criteria of what it would mean to be truly analytically, sociologically post-racial. That's my starting point. That's just a foundation. We ain't there yet. The case for post-racialism has been vastly overstated. Now, quite frankly, even in the age of Obama, right, we got some early indicators that all was not well in the Republic. And I want to return and revisit, for an instant of levity if you can, to the first moment that really said race matters even under a black president. And that involved the arrest of my dear friend and colleague Henry Louis Gates on his own porch in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And I'll let this video kind of speak for itself if we can. I just love that video, so I have to stick that in there. And the Bill Maher people came up with this just within 48 hours after the arrest occurred, so they're very creative folks. But to turn to the more serious side of the talk, I want to engage directly the type of theoretical logic and argument that distinguished sociologist William Judith Wilson developed in his book, The Declining Significance of Race, and to think about how we should understand the dynamics of race and racial change. For those of you who've read Wilson's book, you know he talks about 3 major distinct epochs or eras in American race relations that are defined, as he says, by the conjunction of the economic order and the political order, the economy and the polity, and how those things combine and reinforce one another to create a distinctive system of racial inequality, right? That these are the building blocks of the theory for understanding key eras of racial inequality in the American experience from Wilson's theorization. In particular, he suggests that there were 3 major stages: what he calls the pre-industrial phase, or the plantation economy, which was obviously a slavery-based economy, where virtually all, not total, but virtually all African Americans were agricultural or other low-level laborers enslaved, property held by others as chattel property. We get an industrializing era, which runs from 1830 to 1944, which we can closely identify with the rise eventually of Jim Crow racism being the primary phrase we end up knowing this expressly segregationist, expressly racist era by. But blacks are now free laborers, but held into a profoundly disadvantaged set of roles and positions within the industrializing economy. And then he says we enter the modern or industrial period, or a progressive transition from race-based inequalities to increasingly class-based inequalities. Inequalities driven not by whether you're black, but the type of schooling, the quality of schooling, the sort of training and preparation for competition in the workforce that you have. Now, in crafting this argument, what Wilson discusses but doesn't build expressly into the argument itself as one of the key levers is ideology, our attitudes and beliefs. And so he does write about it, on how we should think about a connection between social structure, the economy, and ideology. And he says, first and foremost, racial belief systems certainly do reinforce and regulate patterns of inequality. They emerge out of specific historical circumstances. Indeed, he goes on to argue, in fact, that once a set of beliefs is in place, it may come to have some autonomous effects. Quoting John Rex, he says, once a deterministic belief system is used to justify a particular stratification situation, that situation is itself changed. Thereby, the belief system may set in motion wholly new social processes. These kind of norms can exert effect that limits the opportunities for a minority group, in this case African Americans, but that norms change as the surrounding economy and circumstances change. This is part of why he doesn't elevate it to the same level as the economy and the polity in its own right. He says, nonetheless, we should consider the interaction between racial norms and the management of interests in workers. Consider. Now, I suggest that we need to reformulate this and, in fact, elevate that third column of considerations, because it's part of why you can have huge change in the economy and the polity and reproduce inequality, even though you've had a huge jolt to the system. So I'm proposing the following figure where certainly the economy matters in structuring racial inequality, the polity matters in structuring inequality. These two things are reinforcing, as Wilson argued. They do indeed shape culture, attitudes, and outlooks, but culture has a huge effect. And my focus on laissez-faire racism will be nothing but an elaboration in many ways of that idea. And in fact, part of the important point here is that there are key feedbacks. Oops. Yeah, you see those arrows there? So you pass a Brown versus Board of Education decision. You have the highest institutional authority unanimously say segregation is unconstitutional and illegal. You literally have Thurgood Marshall stand on the Supreme Court steps, not terribly far from here, 15, 20 miles, and say, within 5 years, there will be no segregated schools in America. Now, if you're a strong structural sociologist, that should have made sense to you. The highest authority in the land just said you got to change. Well, as we all know, that's not what happened. These feedbacks are why it didn't happen. That's the point here. And culture needs to be a central place in the full theoretical model, is the argument. So let's go back to the ideology that was in place at the time of the Brown decision, really. Jim Crow racist ideology, which called for strict segregation by racial background, the white fountains, black-white seating sections of buses, segregated schools, and the like. Whites were expressly entitled to prior access to privileged positions and status. Government had an obligation to enforce and monitor these forms of discrimination, that we absolutely had to forbid racial intermarriage because nothing was worse than the mongrelization that could come from racial mixing and interbreeding. And all of this was premised on the idea that we knew there were categorical, biological, and inherent intellectual and temperamental differences between blacks and whites. That was the foundation of this Jim Crow segregationist ideology. Now, we know from many pieces of survey data that that ideology, at least in terms of publicly expressed attitudes, has been in steady retreat. I'm just going to quickly show this one figure from national surveys, only going back to 1972. For a few of these questions, you could go back to the 60s, a couple all the way back to the 40s, and what you would see is this steady decline. The endorsement of the pro-discrimination, pro-segregation, pro-white privilege argument is just in retreat. It's fading as an ideology that Americans embrace. That red line at the bottom is support for expressly segregated schools. The line at the top is whether a homeowner can keep a black buyer or renter out of his home. All of those things basically in steady retreat to the place where most of them are just out and out rejected. The kind of key thing for the Obama era is this question on whether or not people would be willing to vote for a black candidate for president if nominated by their own party. When first asked in 1958, nearly 60% of white Americans said, heck no, even if my own party nominated such a guy, and no one was truly worried about Adam Clayton Powell back then, I'm not going to do it. By 1984, when Jesse Jackson runs, it's down to 18%. By the time Obama's running in 07, 08, it's down below 1 in 10, right? So it's the validation of that repudiation of Jim Crow. This trend says exactly what Jackson and then ultimately Obama successfully exploited. Now, the decline of Jim Crow in that sense doesn't mean race disappeared as a problem in public attitudes and beliefs. And here I'm just going to quickly recount trends in negative racial stereotypes for two questions, again, from national surveys. The blue line, percentage of white Americans in national surveys saying whites are harder working than African Americans, 66% in 1990, declined a little, I think, down to nearly 40 in 2010. The red line, whites are more intelligent, 56% in 1994, down to about 27, 28% in 2010. What's not shown here is that we could have asked about lots of other traits. Commitment to the family, sexually responsible behavior, involvement with crime, involvement with violence. And it wouldn't take long to create a picture of an America in which the acceptance of negative stereotypes along a lot of traits about African Americans was still ubiquitous, right? A very widespread problem. Stereotypes matter, as I'm sure Jennifer will tell you in much greater and more convincing detail than I, but because I believe in videos these days and have this laptop, let me give you some more direct evidence on the power of stereotypes. Anyway, yeah. You get the point, just how powerful these stereotypes can be. That's not a carefully done experiment, but I think it makes the point pretty convincingly. The stereotypes and their persistence is part of the story of laissez-faire racism. Another piece of it is that many Americans, especially most white Americans, are not convinced, like Justice Roberts, that the government has any special obligation to undo racial inequality. And this is just a trend line on a question, again, beginning in 1972, on whether the government's obligated to help blacks and kind of in between, or really government shouldn't be doing anything to give blacks special treatment. Essentially, 60% have said steadily since the 70s, no, government got no obligation to do this. That's a pretty durable part of public opinion in this domain. Another closely related issue, and this is something I'm going to call the third rail of American race politics, is an element of what some call racial resentment, was once called symbolic racism, modern racism. I actually think analytically we should think of it as a collective racial resentment. It's the idea here that blacks should overcome inequality and prejudice without any special favors. Government don't owe you guys nothing, and nothing for sure should be taken from me to take care of you. And you see pretty steady percentages above, well above 70% of white Americans endorsing that for 20 solid years. A fairly high fraction of African Americans do too, though I will say now quickly, it does not have the emotional tonality or political punch among African Americans that it does among white Americans. I say all this to build up to the idea that there's still this enormous discomfort and tension around race, around recognizing a past history of racial discrimination and bias, and addressing candidly whether that creates any social obligation on America writ large. And this little last piece of humor I'll give to you really drives home that point. Some of you may have seen this recently. All right, now, part of the point of going through that about the changing attitudes and the discomfort that lives in the space with us today is to get to the fact that it's attached to ongoing deep racial inequalities and ongoing discrimination. I want to say quickly several things. We should think about discrimination as something that's cumulative. It has happened over time. It builds from has built from generation to generation. You don't undo that with one act of legislation and a good speech and think that you've wiped out a problem that deep, that massive, that long-lasting. It spans multiple interconnected domains of life. It's not just access to the vote. It's not just access to housing. It's not just access to schools. It's not just access to health care. It's not just access to public transportation. It's not just what you're paid on the job. It's not just how people greet you on the street. It's that whole bundle of things that continue to interact with one another across many domains of life, which makes this whole thing a sedimentary and reinforcing system that's incredibly hard to break down, that demands huge interventions if you're really serious about breaking it down. Because given those attitudes and the nature of discrimination, what you get is a context in which inequality will reproduce itself, Justice Roberts and the colorblind logic notwithstanding. Now, I'm going to give two quick examples to underscore the point that racial inequality in the lifetimes of everybody in this room and at this very moment is in fact getting worse, not better, on two domains. We don't think about it too often, but it's actually getting worse. Let's consider mass incarceration. I'm going to quote a bunch of statistics from a statistical criminologist, Alfred Blumstein. Any of you met this guy? He is not some Afro-Am studies professor about ready to mau-mau the university. This guy is nothing but dust, dirt, and numbers. Here go his numbers, and his language, actually. The black incarceration rate in 1999 was almost 3 times what it had been in 1980. The black to white incarceration ratio was 8-to-1. Approximately 2% of the total black population was incarcerated at the beginning of this century. Nearly 10% of black males in their 20s were in state or federal prison at the beginning of this new century. Nearly a third of black males in their 20s were under some form of criminal justice supervision, probation, parole, or literally in jail or prison. In some jurisdictions, not terribly far from here, in fact, 50% of males in their 20s were under criminal justice supervision. And if you were to do an actuarial forecast of where we stand now, almost a third of black males will serve some time in state or federal prison, as compared with well under 10% of non-Hispanic white males. This problem worsened massively in all of your lifetimes. It happened while you were here and while none of us were watching closely enough. Let's think about the domain of wealth accumulation, wealth inequality. We live in an era, I'll just say it, I don't have time to elaborate, where wealth will determine more and more the quality of your long-term life prospects. A recent Pew Center study posed the question, what happened during the Great Recession, when we had hoped by the mid-2000s that blacks and Latinos in particular might have been closing the wealth gap, black to whites? Well, in 2005, 3 years before the Great Recession, the ratio of black wealth to white wealth was about 10 to 1, 11 to 1, $12,000 in net median worth versus $135,000 for whites. As a result of the Great Recession, that gap leaped up to 20 to 1 because the recession wiped out far more of black and Latino wealth than it did white wealth. During all of our lifetimes, the black-white gap got much, much worse. All right? That's what I want us to think about. I'm going to skip these next slides because I'm taking too much time. And get to what I mean expressly by laissez-faire ideology and wrap this up. It involves, to be sure, a nod against Jim Crow. It is based in part on a rejection of explicit de jure segregation and discrimination. And indeed advocacy of the idea that the state ought to be race neutral, a la Justice Roberts, Scalia, Thomas. However, black-white socioeconomic inequality is viewed as mainly the fault or responsibility of blacks themselves and of African American culture. As a result, people tend to reject the idea that social policy in any strong form ought to act to ameliorate racial and ethnic inequality. And I could base this in a general theory of prejudice, but again, I'll skip that because I'm going to give you the hardcore version of it. We can look at results from focus groups to give you some sense of how this new idea gets expressed verbally in people's comments. Journalist Thomas Edsall and his wife Mary Edsall report on a series of focus groups done by Stanley Greenberg prior to the Clintons running for the White House, trying to answer the question, why are all the white working class defecting to the Republicans? Why are they voting against their own interests? This is the answer. These white Democrat defectors express a profound distaste for blacks, a sentiment that pervades almost everything they think about government and politics. Blacks constitute the explanation for their vulnerability and for almost everything that has gone wrong in their lives. Not being black is what constitutes being middle class. Not living with blacks is what makes a neighborhood a decent place to live. The special status of blacks is perceived by almost all of these individuals as a serious obstacle to their personal advancement. This is a big factor in American national politics, as I suspect Professor Hutchins will demonstrate far more clearly than I. I'm going to skip a couple of these other examples. I love this one. This is a quote from William Julius Wilson's book on neighborhood change in Chicago from one of their respondents. This guy says, look, this whole city is going down the fucking toilet. If Mayor Daley's dad knew what he was doing, he would turn in his grave. Now, old man Daley, he was for the blue-collar worker. Used to be that when you had those jobs, you had them for life and you could raise a family. It's all different now. Taxes and all that shit is killing the working man. We're paying to support, sadly, all these fucking niggers and minorities. Yeah, but I'll tell you, if this city keeps going on the way it's going to drive all the good working people right out of it. It's all fucked up, and I tell you why. Too many niggers and Mexicans and minorities in this city. I mean, niggers don't pay taxes. Spics don't pay taxes. If we leave, there'll be nothing left in this goddamn city. Now, quite frankly, I'm simplifying a little bit, Vince, but I'm sure you'll tell me this feels like a Tea Party person. I collected new data to do this with national sample survey data today. I'm not going to go through that, but I want you to know that people will tell you this in a national survey today. Here's an open-ended comment from our own study. 60-year-old Alabama woman. Now, my husband and I began our lives with nothing, and we worked our butts off and sacrificed for years to get where we are. No one gave us anything. We worked hard to have what we have today. Every person in the U.S., black, white, yellow, brown, red, or any other color, has the freedom to accomplish anything if they work hard enough. Why should we give them everything they don't want to work for? By the way, this is an online survey, so people are typing. And all those caps and stuff, she did that herself. I'm not, I'm not putting that in there. I love this quote. This is from an Arizona male, 52 years old. This is the last example I'll give. I am honestly tired of hearing about black discrimination. It's over with, done with. The blacks are the ones who want to keep it alive because they want everything free and don't want to work for anything. Too many of them are trying to make money off their ancestors, slaves. There are just as many other races who worked the fields and were mistreated. I am tired of hearing about it. I think they should get over it or leave and go back to their own country. My mother is Caucasian. Her mother died at 9, and she had to work in the fields until she was 16. She didn't get any restitution. I'm tired of freeloaders in society who want everything given to them and don't want to work for anything. If they don't like it here, they should go back to their countries of origin and leave us alone. And people forget that it was black people who sold their own people into slavery, not whites. I'm tired of hearing about this crap. Minorities have more opportunities than anyone else these days, even illegals. I assume he means Mexicans. Enough is enough. You get the tenor of this way of thinking about politics and how this is close to the top of people's heads, man. You touch this, boom! You know, that's why I call it the third rail of American politics, Jack, because you don't want to get near it, as poor Obama did when the Reverend Jeremiah Wright tape came out, and then when he said the Cambridge police acted stupidly when they arrested Henry Lew. You touch this, and politicians, stuff gets fried all around it. All right, I will end up here. Skip that stuff. Okay, I'll just go to the very end. I think this analysis of the shifting character of racism is in the end a troubling diagnosis of the character of our times. We're not a post-racial social order. We're not a colorblind social order, but we are instead one defined by a new cultural ideology of laissez-faire racism, to my mind. This is an ongoing challenge and threat to the health of democracy and civic life in the U.S. I was challenged in part when invited here to speak to solutions, and like any good sociologist, I am far longer on diagnosis than I am on prescription, as you've already learned. But the prescription here is first and foremost, I don't believe that there's a colorblind way out of this problem. You cannot ignore your way out of the nature of these inequalities and disadvantages, and no matter how much ahistorical, asocial, legal reasoning you invoke, you won't be an honest arbiter of getting toward a just outcome. Secondly, it requires then that we remain overtly committed to a progressive project. What do I mean by that? By dealing with race in a way that is intended to be progressive in its effects. And the last example I give is the politics of what happened to the mixed and multi-race category on the census. The great push for that to change, so you could mark more than one on the 2000 census, came primarily from the parents of mixed-race kids, in particular, the white mothers of kids who were typically perceived as black. They went to lobby Congress so that their kids wouldn't have to check off just daddy's race, but could also check off mommy's race on the box. It turned out their enemies ended up being the traditional civil rights leadership. The NAACP, the Legal Defense Fund, MALDEF, all of these progressive groups were fighting these people who merely wanted their kids to be able to acknowledge their full identities. And because these folks, however true and real their aspiration was, hadn't thought through what it meant to have a progressive politics, who did their allies end up being as they pushed for this? Newt Gingrich. The far right-wing conservative Speaker of the House ends up being the main engine behind this political change. There were ways to get to the end they wanted that were more progressive if you had known having an express progressive political project is what you should have been about. So you can't get there in a colorblind way. One has to be truly thoughtful politically about what it means to pursue a progressive agenda intended to reduce, mitigate, and eliminate inequalities, bias, and disadvantage, not merely allow it to work willy-nilly. And so the last thought in it is my favorite quote of Martin Luther King's, which he drew from philosopher Paul Tillich: "The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice." Thank you very much.